Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The September sun was beginning its slow, golden descent over Ocala, Florida, painting the sky in hues of soft lavender and fiery orange. In a quiet suburban home, nestled amongst the sprawling live oaks draped in Spanish moss, a young couple was preparing for an evening out. The air inside was filled with the easy, comfortable silence of a shared life, the kind of silence that speaks of 2 years of laughter, whispered secrets, and the gentle rhythm of two hearts beating in sync. Paulina Wright, at 25, was a woman of quiet radiance. Her beauty was not the loud, demanding kind, but a gentle luminescence that emanated from a core of kindness and grace. She was, as her boyfriend Leslie would later say, a woman who was modest, respectful, and fiercely loyal. She had a way of seeing the best in people, a gentle optimism that could coax a smile from the most hardened of faces. She had met Leslie Boileau Jr. on a dating app, a modern-day meet-cute that had blossomed into a love that felt as old and as steady as the ancient oaks outside their window. Leslie, at 33, was a man who wore the mantle of authority with a practiced ease. For 8 years, he had served as a deputy with the Marion County Sheriff's Office, his life a testament to order, discipline, and the clear, unyielding lines of the law. He was a man who understood the weight of a uniform, the power of a badge, and the solemn responsibility that came with carrying a firearm. With Paulina, however, he was simply Leslie, a man who had found in her a soft place to land, a gentle soul who encouraged him to be a better person. She was his anchor, the quiet harbor in the often turbulent sea of his profession. That evening, September 19th, 2024, was meant to be a simple, happy one. They had spent the day together, a lazy Tuesday that unfolded with the easy rhythm of a life intertwined. They had gone to lunch at Longhorn Steakhouse, browsed the aisles of Target and TJ Maxx, and returned home with the small treasures of a day spent in each other's company. As evening approached, they decided to go out for Mexican food, a favorite indulgence. At the restaurant, the atmosphere was festive, the conversation light. They ordered drinks, a 2-for-1 special that saw them each enjoy 3 margaritas, the sweet, tangy liquid a pleasant buzz against the backdrop of their easy laughter. They returned home around 8:30 p.m., the night still young, the air still warm. The house was a sanctuary, a private world they had built together. As the evening wore on, a new, and in retrospect fatally curious, idea took hold. Leslie, a man whose life was inextricably linked with firearms, decided to clean his guns. It was a routine he had performed countless times, a familiar ritual of maintenance and care. But this time, Paulina was there, her curiosity piqued. She had never shown much interest in his firearms before, but tonight, something was different. She wanted to learn. What began as a simple act of curiosity, a lesson between lovers, would soon spiral into a nightmare of unimaginable horror. Leslie, the seasoned law enforcement officer, the man who knew the deadly potential of a firearm better than most, began to show her the ropes. He brought out his service handgun, its cold, hard steel a stark contrast to the soft warmth of their living room. He demonstrated how to handle it, how to perform dry fire exercises, the click of the empty chamber a harmless punctuation in their late-night lesson. Then he brought out the AR-15, a semi-automatic rifle, a weapon of immense power. It was a gun he knew intimately, a tool of his trade. And it was here, in the quiet, unassuming space of their shared home, that the lines between safety and recklessness, between love and tragedy, began to blur with a terrifying, irreversible speed. The story of what happened next would be told in a hushed, sterile courtroom, pieced together from the frantic, panicked words of a 911 call, the cold, clinical findings of a medical examiner, and the halting, self-serving testimony of a man trying to explain the inexplicable. At around 11 p.m., the dispatch center of the Ocala Police Department received a call. The voice on the other end was hysterical, a man's scream of pure, undiluted terror. It was Leslie Boileau. "My girlfriend, she was shot in the head," he sobbed, his words a broken, gasping torrent of panic. He told the dispatcher they had been cleaning guns, that it was an accident. The dispatcher, her voice a calm, steady counterpoint to his hysteria, tried to get him to render aid, but Leslie was lost in a fog of shock and horror. "I don't know what to do," he wailed, the sound a gut-wrenching symphony of a world that had just been shattered. When the first responders arrived, they were met with a scene of grim, heartbreaking finality. The house, which had just hours before been a space of warmth and love, was now a crime scene. Paulina Wright was sitting in a chair, a single, devastating gunshot wound to her head. Leslie was behind her, his arms wrapped around her, her blood a stark, crimson stain against the backdrop of their shared life. The paramedics rushed in, their movements a frantic, desperate dance against the inevitable. But it was too late. Paulina Wright, the gentle soul with the radiant smile, was pronounced dead at the scene. The hours that followed were a blur of flashing lights, yellow tape, and the quiet, methodical work of homicide detectives. Leslie, his hands and clothes stained with Paulina's blood, was taken outside, his initial shock giving way to a rambling, often contradictory, account of the night's events. He told the investigators about their dinner, the drinks, the gun-cleaning lesson. He claimed that Paulina had been handling his handgun, that she had pointed it at him and dry-fired, a playful, innocent gesture in their private world. Then he said he picked up the AR-15. He pointed it at her. He pulled the trigger. He claimed he thought the rifle was unloaded, that it would just click, another harmless demonstration in their late-night lesson. He said the first time he pulled the trigger, it did just that. But the second time, the rifle had roared to life, a single, deafening shot that had stolen the life of the woman he loved. But as the investigation deepened, the simple, tragic narrative of a terrible accident began to fray at the edges. The physical evidence told a different, more complex story. The medical examiner's report was chilling in its clinical precision. The bullet had not just entered Paulina's forehead. It had passed through her hand first, a silent, heartbreaking testament to a final, instinctive act of self-preservation. She had raised her hand, a desperate, futile shield against the deadly projectile that was hurtling towards her. And then there was Leslie's own behavior, captured on the unblinking eye of the officer's body cameras. The initial hysteria had given way to a strange, almost performative, display of grief. He rolled on the ground, his screams echoing in the quiet suburban night, his words a jumble of self-recrimination and confusion. "I knew better," he sobbed. "I shouldn't have let this happen." But in the same breath, he made statements that seemed to shift the blame, to paint a picture of a shared, reckless game. "We were pointing the guns at each other," he told the officers, a statement that would later come back to haunt him. The man who had been a guardian of the law was now a suspect in a homicide. The life he had so carefully constructed had been demolished in a single catastrophic moment of what prosecutors would later call culpable negligence. After a thorough investigation, Leslie Boileau Jr., the 8-year veteran of the Marion County Sheriff's Office, was arrested and charged with manslaughter with a firearm. The tragic accident, the state of Florida alleged, was a crime. The trial of Leslie Boileau Jr. began in late September 2025, a year after Paulina's death. The courtroom was a theater of quiet, restrained grief, Paulina's family a silent, heartbreaking presence, their faces etched with a pain that time had not softened. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorneys Richard Buxman and Tucker O'Neill, laid out a case that was not about intent, but about a catastrophic criminal failure of judgment. They presented the jury with a portrait of a man who, despite his years of training and experience, had abandoned the most fundamental principles of firearm safety. He had been drinking. He had been handling a loaded weapon in a casual, reckless manner. He had pointed a deadly weapon at another human being and pulled the trigger. The fact that he was a law enforcement officer, they argued, made his actions not less but more egregious. He, of all people, should have known better. The defense, on the other hand, painted a picture of a tragic, heartbreaking accident, a moment of inexplicable human error that had ended in a lifetime of regret. They argued that Leslie had loved Paulina, that he had no reason to harm her, that he was as much a victim of this tragedy as she was. The trial reached its dramatic climax when Leslie Boileau Jr. took the stand in his own defense. He was no longer the hysterical, grieving boyfriend. He was a man fighting for his life, his testimony a carefully constructed narrative of a night gone horribly wrong. He told the jury about his love for Paulina, about her curiosity, about the gun-cleaning lesson that had turned into a nightmare. He claimed he was performing a function test on the rifle, listening for a clicking sound, his eyes on the television, not on Paulina when the gun discharged. "Did you intend to shoot Paulina?" his lawyer asked. "No," he said, his voice firm. "Did you intend to discharge that weapon?" "No," he repeated. "I thought it was going to click." But under the relentless, probing cross-examination of Assistant State Attorney Tucker O'Neill, his story began to crumble. O'Neill forced him to confront the simple, brutal facts of the case. "The rifle was in your possession and control when it fired, wasn't it?" "Yes," Leslie admitted. "You intentionally pulled the trigger, didn't you?" "Yes." O'Neill then walked him through the basics of firearm safety, the rules that had been drilled into him during his years of law enforcement training, the rules he had so spectacularly violated on that fateful night. He pointed out the chilling conclusion of the medical examiner's report, the fact that the bullet's trajectory meant that the gun had been aimed directly at Paulina's forehead when it was fired. The jury, a group of 6 ordinary citizens, was then given the unenviable task of weighing the evidence, of deciding whether this was a tragic accident or a criminal act. They listened to the harrowing 911 call, they watched the gut-wrenching body camera footage, they heard the cold, clinical testimony of the medical examiner, and they looked into the eyes of the man who had pulled the trigger. After a multi-day trial, they returned with a verdict. Leslie Boileau Jr. was found guilty of manslaughter with a firearm. The verdict was a declaration that his actions, regardless of his intent, had been so reckless, so negligent, that they constituted a crime. It was a verdict that underscored a simple, powerful truth, that no one, not even a law enforcement officer, is above the law. The conviction carried a potential sentence of up to 30 years in prison, a future of steel and concrete for a man who had once been on the other side of the bars. For Paulina's family, the verdict was not a victory, but a small, somber measure of accountability. It could not bring back their daughter, it could not heal the wound that would forever scar their lives, but it was an acknowledgement that her life had value, that her death was not just a tragic accident, but a crime that demanded justice. This verdict underscores that no one is above the law, and offenders must be held accountable when negligence or recklessness leads to the tragic loss of life, said Bill Gladson, the 5th Judicial Circuit State Attorney, his words a final, formal chapter in a story of profound and senseless loss. The story of Paulina Wright is a heartbreaking cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of a single moment of reckless abandon. It is a story of a love that was shattered by the very object that was meant to represent a man's profession, his commitment to protect and serve. It is a story that serves as a chilling reminder that the line between a tool of protection and an instrument of death is as thin as a trigger pull, as fragile as a human life. And at its heart, it is the story of a gentle, radiant soul who was stolen from the world far too soon. A woman whose memory is now a silent, poignant plea for a world where love is not a prelude to tragedy, and where the people who are sworn to protect us do not become the authors of our deepest sorrows. The house in Ocala is quiet now, the echo of a gunshot long faded, but for a family that will forever grieve, and for a man who will spend his years behind bars, the sound of that single, catastrophic shot will reverberate for a lifetime. Story 2. The final hours of 2022 bled into the first moments of 2023 in a quiet, unassuming house in Cohasset, a wealthy coastal town south of Boston. The air outside was crisp with the promise of a New England winter, the bare branches of ancient trees clawing at a sky awash with the faint glow of distant city lights. Inside, the warmth was a carefully constructed facade. Laughter echoed, wine glasses clinked, and a festive dinner was shared. It was New Year's Eve, a time for reflection and resolutions, for turning a page and starting anew. Anna Walsh, at 39, was a woman who embodied the very essence of a fresh start. Born Anil Jabisic in Belgrade, Serbia, she had arrived in the United States in 2005 with a degree in French literature and a fierce, burning ambition. She was a whirlwind of energy and charisma, a woman who had carved out a remarkable life for herself in her adopted country. She had worked her way up through the luxury hospitality industry, her intelligence and drive propelling her from one prestigious hotel to another. Now she was a regional general manager for Tishman Speyer, a major real estate firm, a high-powered job that demanded her time and her brilliance. Her life was a delicate, often frantic, balancing act. She was a mother to 3 young sons, aged 2, 4, and 6, boys who were the anchor of her world. And she was a wife. Her husband, Brian Walsh, was a man whose life was as tangled and murky as hers was clear and aspirational. Brian, the son of a prominent neurosurgeon, was a man who had lived his life in the shadow of expectation and disappointment. He was estranged from his family, cut out of his father's will with nothing more than best wishes. He had a history of failed ventures and a present defined by a serious legal predicament. In 2021, he had pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges for selling counterfeit Andy Warhol paintings, a crime that had left him under house arrest, his world shrinking to the confines of their Cohasset home, his future hanging in the balance of a pending sentencing. Their marriage, like the house on New Year's Eve, was a space of profound contradictions. From the outside, they were a picture of success, the beautiful, ambitious immigrant, the well-heeled husband, the 3 perfect children. But beneath the surface, the foundations were cracking. Anna's job required her to split her time between their home in Cohasset and a townhouse in Washington, D.C. The distance was more than just geographical. In D.C., she was building a life for herself, a life that was increasingly separate from the man she had married in 2016. Towards the end of 2022, Anna was quietly, methodically planning her exit. She had confided in friends that she was preparing to leave Brian, to move with her sons to D.C. permanently. She had sold off assets, amassing a significant amount of cash. She was having an affair, a relationship with a man in D.C. that had been going on for months. The life she was building was one of independence, a life free from the man whose world was closing in around him. Brian knew, or at least he suspected. In the final weeks of 2022, his paranoia had festered. He had his mother hire a private investigator to follow Anna in Washington. He had searched online for divorce lawyers. The idea of losing control, of Anna leaving with the children and the money, was a threat he could not tolerate. He believed, as prosecutors would later allege, that his wife's death could be his salvation, a way to gain custody of the children and perhaps earn a more lenient sentence in his fraud case, a way to inherit her considerable life insurance policies, which totaled over $2.7 million. The guest at their New Year's Eve dinner was a friend of Brian's. The conversation was light, the mood festive. At around 1:30 a.m., after the guest had departed, Anna and Brian went to bed. In those dark, early hours of the new year, Anna made a few calls. She tried to reach her mother in Serbia, her sister, her maid of honor. No one answered. The calls went to voicemail, unheard cries into the digital void. It was the last time anyone other than Brian Walsh would have any contact with her. The story that Brian would tell was simple, plausible on its surface. He claimed that on the morning of January 1st, Anna had been called into work for an emergency. She had kissed him goodbye, he said, and left the house between 6 and 7 a.m. to catch a flight to D.C. from Boston's Logan Airport. It was a story designed to create a gap in time, a buffer of plausible deniability. It was a lie. On January 4th, After Anna had failed to show up for work, her employer in D.C. contacted the police. Separately, Brian also reported her missing. The Cohasset police performed a wellness check at the Walsh home. Brian was calm, cooperative. He recounted his story about the early morning work emergency. He told them he had spent the rest of New Year's Day running errands and visiting his mother in the nearby town of Swampscott. But even in those early days, the threads of his story began to unravel. He claimed he had visited a CVS and a Whole Foods in Swampscott, but surveillance footage from the stores showed no sign of him. He said he had gotten lost on the way to his mother's because he didn't have his phone, but cell phone data would later show that his phone was at his home, fully charged. While a search for Anna began, a frantic effort involving local and state police combing through the wooded areas near their home, investigators started to piece together a different timeline. A timeline not of a woman who had disappeared, but of a man who was trying to make someone disappear. On January 2nd, the day after Anna supposedly left for D.C., surveillance footage captured Brian Walsh at a Home Depot in Rockland. He was wearing a black surgical mask and blue surgical gloves. He paid in cash, a total of $450, for a shopping cart full of cleaning supplies. The receipt was a chilling grocery list for a man with a monstrous task ahead of him: mops, brushes, tape, a Tyvek suit with boot covers, buckets, goggles, and a hatchet. The investigation was now running on two parallel tracks: the public, increasingly desperate search for a missing mother of three, and the secret, horrifying discovery of what her husband was doing while the world was looking for her. While search parties braved the cold, Brian was making trips to dumpsters across the region, methodically disposing of heavy-duty trash bags. The digital trail he left behind was even more damning. On his son's iPad, in the hours and days after Anna was last seen, Brian Walsh had conducted a series of gruesome Google searches. The queries were a window into a mind consumed with the grim logistics of covering up a murder. At 4:55 a.m. on January 1st, just hours after he claimed she had left for the airport, he searched. How long before a body starts to smell? A minute later, how to stop a body from smelling? At 5:47 a.m., 10 ways to dispose of a dead body if you really need to. The searches continued throughout the day and into the next, a sickening litany of a man researching his own monstrous crime. How long for someone to be missing to inherit? Can you be charged with murder without a body? Dismemberment and the best ways to dispose of a body. What happens to hair on a dead body? What is the rate of decomposition of a body found in a plastic bag compared to on a surface in the woods? Can baking soda make a body smell good? On January 8th, armed with the evidence of his lies about his whereabouts and the suspicious Home Depot purchases, police arrested Brian Walsh. The initial charge was not murder, but misleading investigators. He pleaded not guilty, his face a blank mask of composure in the courtroom. That same day, investigators executed a search warrant on the Walsh home. In the basement, they found what they were looking for. There was blood, and there was a bloody, damaged knife. The house that had once been a home was now officially a crime scene. The search for evidence intensified. Investigators began tracking down the dumpsters that Brian had visited. At a transfer station in Peabody, they found what they had been dreading. Amidst the mountains of trash, they discovered 10 trash bags containing items stained with blood. Inside were a hatchet, a hacksaw, a rug, cleaning supplies, and some of Anna Walsh's personal belongings, including her COVID-19 vaccination card. They also found her clothes and a purse. The evidence was overwhelming. Anna Walsh hadn't just disappeared. She had been erased. On January 18th, Brian Walsh was charged with the murder of his wife. The charge sheet was a formal declaration of what investigators now believed with chilling certainty: that Brian Walsh had beaten his wife to death in their home, dismembered her body in the basement, and then, over the course of several days, disposed of her remains in dumpsters across eastern Massachusetts. The motive, prosecutors argued, was a toxic cocktail of greed and control. He was about to be sentenced for his art fraud, facing the prospect of prison time. Anna was leaving him, taking the children, and she had the financial means to do so. Her death, he believed, would solve all his problems. He would get the children, he would get the insurance money, and he might even get a lighter sentence. The case became a media sensation, a story of suburban horror that captivated and repulsed the public in equal measure. The details were gruesome, the planning meticulous, the deception audacious. The image of a man coolly researching how to dismember his wife on his child's iPad while the world searched for her was a portrait of a sociopath in action. The legal proceedings began to move forward. In March 2023, a grand jury indicted Brian Walsh on charges of first-degree murder, misleading a police investigation, and improper conveyance of a human body. He continued to plead not guilty. His defense team, faced with a mountain of forensic and digital evidence, clung to one critical fact. Anna Walsh's body had never been found. Without a body, they argued, there was no definitive proof of how she died, or even that she was dead at all. The case has been a slow, grinding journey through the legal system. The trial, initially set for an earlier date, has been delayed. A judge ordered Brian to undergo a mental competency evaluation. The prosecution and defense have battled over evidence, over witness lists, over the very narrative of what happened in that house in Cohasset. A new, unexpected complication has arisen in the form of a controversial state trooper, Michael Proctor, who was involved in the investigation. Proctor was later fired for his conduct in another high-profile murder case, and his involvement in the Walsh investigation has become a potential flashpoint for the defense, a way to cast doubt on the integrity of the evidence collected against Brian. As of October 2025, Brian Walsh remains in jail, awaiting a trial now scheduled to begin later in the month. He maintains his innocence, a man who built a cage of lies and then locked himself inside it. The world is left with the ghost of Anna Walsh, a woman of light and life who was consumed by a darkness that had been hiding in plain sight. Her 3 young sons are now orphans, their mother stolen from them, their father accused of the monstrous act. They are the silent, innocent victims at the heart of this tragedy, their lives forever altered by the events that transpired in the first few hours of a new year. The story of Anna Walsh is a chilling cautionary tale about the secrets that can fester behind the closed doors of a seemingly perfect life. It is a story of ambition and betrayal, of love and control, of a meticulously planned crime and the digital breadcrumbs that brought it to light. And it is a story without a final chapter. The search for Anna's body continues, a search for a final resting place, for a semblance of peace for a family shattered by an unimaginable horror. The trial of Brian Walsh looms, a legal battle that will attempt to bring a measure of justice to a crime that is, in its very essence, a profound and permanent injustice. The world waits to see if a man who tried so hard to erase his wife will finally be held accountable for the empty space she left behind. Story 3. The morning sun rose over Kenosha, Wisconsin, on May 18, 2020, exactly as it had every morning before, warming the quiet residential streets near 15th Street, where rows of modest apartment buildings sat close together beneath tall oak trees. Nothing about the light looked different. Nothing about the birdsong hinted that anything was wrong. But inside apartment number 2, in a building that had always felt safe, something terrible had already happened, and the world outside simply did not know it yet. Rosalio Gutierrez Jr., a 40-year-old man everyone affectionately called Pocho, had not shown up for work that day. He was known as a devoted Chicago Cubs fan, a man who loved his family fiercely, and a father who never missed the chance to be present in his children's lives. His absence on a workday was unusual enough to raise eyebrows among people who knew him well, but nobody yet understood that this was the first thread in a mystery that would take 3 years to unravel, one that would end without ever recovering the one thing that mattered most: Rosalio himself. Rosalio was a man who showed up. He showed up for his son's baseball games, cheering from the sidelines with the kind of pride that only a devoted parent carries. He showed up for the people he loved, and in the months before his disappearance, that meant showing up for a woman named Sadie Beecham. a mother of 3 who had recently begun a new chapter in her life after leaving a difficult relationship. Sadie had once been in a long relationship with a man named Zachariah Anderson, with whom she shared 3 children. That relationship had ended, but Anderson had not truly let go. As Sadie moved forward and began building something new with Rosalio, a quiet darkness was growing in the shadows of her old relationship, one that neither she nor Rosalio could have fully seen coming. By May 2020, Rosalio and Sadie's relationship had blossomed into something real. He sent her good morning texts, the kind of small, tender gesture that becomes a quiet anchor in daily life. It was the kind of ordinary intimacy that people build their lives around, never imagining it could be taken away in a single night. On the morning of May 19, 2020, Sadie waited for her usual message from Rosalio. It did not arrive. Anyone who has loved someone knows that particular flavor of unease, the small nagging feeling that something is not right, easily dismissed at first, but impossible to fully shake. Sadie tried to reach him. Nothing. By the time she made her way to his Kenosha apartment, that unease had sharpened into real fear. When she arrived, the patio door stood open, which was strange enough on its own. Then she noticed something dark red spattered near the entrance. Through the blinds, she could see enough of the living room to understand that something had gone horribly wrong inside that apartment, though nothing could have prepared her for the full scope of what investigators would later uncover. An area rug that should have been there was missing entirely. She called the police immediately. When officers arrived to conduct a welfare check, they stepped into a scene that told a story no one wanted to read. Blood covered the floor, splashed across the furniture, and reached all the way up to the ceiling. It was such a staggering amount of blood that investigators would later conclude, even without a body, that Rosalio could not possibly have survived whatever had happened in that room. Rosalio Gutierrez Jr. was gone. His body has never been found, not that day, not in the months that followed, not even after his killer was convicted years later. Detectives did not have to search far for a starting point. Sadie told them almost immediately about a man who had been shadowing her life for months. Her ex, Zachariah Anderson. She explained that she had begun to suspect he was tracking her movements, that something about his sudden appearances and knowledge of her whereabouts felt too precise to be coincidence. It did not take long for that suspicion to be confirmed in the most unsettling way. Investigators discovered that Anderson had placed a hidden GPS tracker, paired with a voice-activated listening device, inside Sadie's car. He had been listening. He had been watching. And somewhere in that surveillance, he had learned about Rosalio. Just 3 days after Rosalio vanished, on May 20th, 2020, Anderson was arrested, though at that point police could only charge him with stalking. The homicide charge would come later, once the physical evidence caught up with the suspicion that had already taken root in the minds of investigators. What detectives found next painted a picture that was almost cinematic in its chilling precision. Surveillance footage from a local Walmart showed Anderson shopping the very morning after Rosalio was last seen alive. His purchases were the kind that made investigators' stomachs turn. Garbage bags, latex gloves, bleach wipes, and strangely cans of sardines. It read like a shopping list for erasing evidence of violence, though the sardines would remain an odd, almost darkly comic detail that no one could fully explain, later found unopened and discarded under the passenger seat of his van. On the very day that Rosalio's disappearance was discovered, officers found something else. Burned pits, still smoldering, at 2 separate locations connected to Anderson, one at his own home and another at a family-owned tree farm. Inside those ashes, a cadaver dog located fragments of burned clothing and the remains of a bleach bottle. Someone had been trying very hard to make something disappear. Then came the detail that would eventually seal the case in court. Forensic analysts tested Anderson's work van and found a tiny, pinhead-sized dark stain. DNA testing confirmed what investigators already feared. The blood belonged to Rosalio Gutierrez. The van's interior carpet had been partially removed, and the whole vehicle carried the sharp chemical smell of bleach, as though someone had scrubbed frantically at something that would not fully come clean. By December 2020, 7 months after Rosalio vanished, prosecutors felt they had enough. Anderson was charged with first-degree intentional homicide and hiding a corpse, in addition to the stalking charges he already faced. He pleaded not guilty to everything and would maintain his innocence for years to come. As the case built toward trial, a disturbing portrait of obsession began to emerge, one that reached far beyond a single night of violence. Witnesses described Anderson as a man who had become consumed by jealousy over Sadie's new relationship, unable to accept that she had moved on, having grown obsessed with his ex-girlfriend in the months leading up to the killing. Perhaps the most heartbreaking witness in the entire case was not an adult at all, but Anderson's own teenage daughter, a child caught in the impossible position of testifying against her father. She told the court that Anderson had asked her to spy on her mother, instructing her to record every single time my mother would get upset. She said he frequently brought up Rosalio when she saw him, unable to let the subject rest. Then she described something that still lingers as one of the most disturbing details of the entire case. Less than a month before Rosalio disappeared, on the night of April 24th, Anderson had driven his own daughter with him to Sadie's home, so the two of them could watch Sadie and Rosalio together through the window. He went through Rosalio's truck that night, photographing the license plate and registration. He rang the doorbell and then fled into the darkness. His daughter recalled him talking about his plans for Rosalio, saying he wanted to show him who the man was. She remembered his exact words, that he might just watch him or follow him to his house one time just for the fun of it. At the time, she said, she did not fully understand what her father meant. Looking back from the witness stand, the meaning had become unbearably clear. The trial itself, held in Kenosha County Circuit Court before Judge Bruce Schroeder, the same judge who had presided over the high-profile Kyle Rittenhouse case, stretched across 17 dramatic days beginning in late February 2023. It was a trial defined by raw emotion and moments of real courtroom tension. One of the most jarring moments came when Anderson's own daughter took the stand on March 15, 2023, testifying not only about the stalking but about a marijuana operation and a gun she said she had once been threatened with, though she did not identify her father as the one who threatened her. As she spoke, prosecutors accused Anderson of trying to silently signal her to stop, claiming he put his hand to his mouth and clamped his lips shut while staring at her from across the courtroom. The defense, in turn, accused Sadie of using sign language to communicate with the same daughter during her testimony. The courtroom grew so charged that the clerk reported witnessing Anderson's attempted communication, forcing the court to bring in a replacement clerk for the remainder of the case. Judge Schroeder himself grew visibly frustrated at points, at one moment exclaiming, "Oh, for crumb's sake," after learning a witness subpoena had expired, before admitting to the courtroom, "I feel like I've lost control." Perhaps the most damning testimony came from an unlikely source, a man named Mark in Washington, who had shared a jail cell with Anderson while he awaited trial. Washington testified that Anderson had confessed to him, admitting to stabbing Gutierrez and describing, in unsettling detail, how he had planned the killing by learning Rosalio's routines, his vehicle, and the timing needed to catch him alone. Forensic evidence continued to mount throughout the trial. An officer who examined the blood spatter patterns in Rosalio's apartment testified that at least 7 distinct events had produced the bloodstains found across the walls, ceiling, cabinet, and couch, evidence of a violent, prolonged struggle rather than a single quick act. Perhaps most gut-wrenching of all was the testimony from Rosalio's own mother, Celia Patterson, who described going to clean out her son's apartment after his disappearance and opening the refrigerator, only to find his cell phone and other personal belongings hidden inside. Throughout it all, Anderson chose not to testify in his own defense. He sat through the month-long trial showing little visible emotion, even as the evidence against him piled higher day after day. On March 22, 2023, after nearly 10 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Zachariah Anderson was found guilty on every count he faced: first-degree intentional homicide, hiding a corpse, and 2 counts of stalking, one against Sadie and one against Rosalio himself. As the verdict was read aloud, Anderson reportedly showed no visible emotion. Outside the courthouse, Rosalio's family, many of them dressed in Chicago Cubs gear in tribute to the man they had lost, finally allowed themselves to feel something like relief. His mother, Celia Patterson, spoke to reporters with words that captured nearly 3 years of grief and waiting. "I'm eternally grateful," she said. "My husband, family, and I, Rosalio, finally has justice." On May 16, 2023, almost exactly 3 years to the day since Rosalio was last seen alive, Anderson stood before Judge Schroeder for sentencing. The judge did not hold back his assessment of what Anderson had done. "What you did was frightening," Schroeder told him directly. Anderson was sentenced to life in prison for the homicide charge, with the possibility of parole only after 40 years. On top of that life sentence, he received 2 years in prison plus 2 years of extended supervision for each of the 2 stalking counts, and 6 years in prison with 5 years of supervision for hiding Rosalio's corpse, all of it to be served consecutively. During sentencing, several people delivered victim impact statements, including Sadie Beecham, Anderson's own daughter, and Rosalio's grieving mother. Anderson addressed the court that day too, and even facing a lifetime behind bars, he continued to insist he was innocent. More than 3 years after Rosalio Gutierrez Jr. disappeared from his Kenosha apartment, his body has never been recovered. The burned pits, the bleach, the missing carpet, and the confession to a cellmate gave prosecutors enough to secure a conviction and a life sentence. But they never gave Rosalio's family the one thing they may have wanted most: the chance to bring him home and lay him properly to rest. A case built on the quiet, devastating power of forensic detail. A single speck of blood in a van, a bleach bottle in a fire pit, a phone hidden in a refrigerator, each fragment small on its own, but together forming an undeniable picture of what happened on the night jealousy turned into violence. Rosalio's family continues to carry his memory forward, remembering him not as a case number or a headline, but as a devoted father, a loyal friend, and a man whose Chicago Cubs cap became, in the end, a small and lasting symbol of everything that was taken from them far too soon. Story 4. The evening of June 2nd, 2007, arrived in Overland Park, Kansas, the way most summer evenings did in that quiet corner of the Midwest. Warm air pressing gently against the windows, the sound of lawnmowers fading into the distance, families settling into the comfortable rhythm of a Saturday night. 18-year-old Kelsey and Smith moved through her house with the particular energy of a young woman in love, checking her reflection, gathering her keys, thinking about the small gift she wanted to buy before her 6-month anniversary date with her boyfriend, John Beersmith. She had graduated high school only weeks earlier, her whole life spread out before her like an unmarked map, full of possibility. No one in that house, no one on that street, could have imagined that this ordinary errand would become the final chapter of her life. Kelsey told her father she was heading to Target, just a quick trip, nothing that required a second thought. She drove her Buick Regal to the store at 97th and Quivira, tucked behind Oak Park Mall, a place so familiar to the town's residents that it barely registered as a location. It was simply the Target, the one everyone went to for the small necessities of daily life. She parked, walked inside, and began browsing for something meaningful to give the boy she loved. She called her mother from inside the store, her voice light and unhurried, mentioning nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested danger was already stitching itself into the fabric of that night. What Kelsey did not know, what no camera operator, no store clerk, no passerby seemed to notice in that moment, was that 30 seconds after she stepped through the entrance, a man followed her in. He was in his mid-20s, dressed simply in a white shirt and dark shorts, unremarkable in every visible way. He did not speak to her. He did not approach her. He simply watched, drifting through the same aisles she moved through, appearing again and again at a careful distance in the store's surveillance footage, as though he were memorizing her patterns, her vulnerabilities, the exact rhythm of her evening. Later, investigators would learn his name: Edwin Roy Hall, sometimes called Jack, a resident of nearby Olathe with a wife and a 4-year-old son waiting for him at home. He had no adult criminal record, but beneath that unremarkable exterior lived a history of violence that had surfaced in adolescence. An assault charge, a knife once raised against a family member, another boy struck with a baseball bat. He had learned, somewhere in his life, how to appear ordinary. That evening, ordinary was exactly the disguise he needed. Kelsey finished her shopping, selected her boyfriend's gift, and walked to the checkout counter. The cashier who rang up her purchase noticed nothing strange in her demeanor, nothing strange in the moment at all. Hall, meanwhile, had already slipped out of the store just before she reached the register, as though he understood exactly when to disappear from view and reappear where it would matter most. Outside, in the parking lot, in the dimming light of a Kansas evening, where store cameras captured only distant shapes and shadows. At 7:07 p.m., Kelsey was last seen in that parking lot. The footage, when investigators slowed it down frame by frame in the agonizing days that followed, revealed something the naked eye had missed on first viewing. A flash of motion near her car, consistent with a person moving quickly, aggressively, forcing someone into a vehicle. It was the last visual trace of Kelsey Smith as herself, as a free young woman standing on ordinary ground. Somewhere in that grainy footage, in that fraction of a second, her life bent irrevocably onto a different path. Hours passed before anyone realized something was wrong. Her parents and her boyfriend, growing anxious when her calls and texts went unanswered, drove to the Target, scanning the lot for her car, for any sign of her presence. They found nothing. The Buick Regal was gone. Kelsey herself was gone. Panic, the kind that claws up from the stomach into the throat, began to take hold of the Smith family that night, a panic that would not fully release its grip for 4 unbearable days. Police were called, and what began as a missing persons report quickly escalated into something far more urgent. Investigators pulled the Target surveillance tapes and began piecing together the timeline. Kelsey entering the store, the unidentified man trailing her at a distance, her departure, and then, nothing certain, only shadows and inference. Approximately 4 hours after she vanished, her car was discovered abandoned in the parking lot of a Macy's across the street, near Oak Park Mall. Inside sat her purse, her wallet, and the very gift she had purchased for her boyfriend, untouched, as though she had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. The sight of those personal items, ordinary and heartbreakingly intact, told investigators immediately that whatever had happened to Kelsey Smith had not been a matter of choice. The Macy's parking lot footage offered another piece of the puzzle. At 9:17 p.m., nearly 2 hours after the abduction, a figure could be seen exiting Kelsey's car and running toward the street, disappearing into the darkness. The clothing matched what witnesses had seen on the man from the Target footage: a white shirt, dark pants. But the night had grown too dark to determine even basic details like the person's gender with certainty. When investigators released a still image of the suspect to local media, hundreds of tips poured in, yet most were too vague, too speculative, to lead anywhere concrete. It was a frustrating irony. The public was desperate to help, flooding hotlines with guesses, while the one piece of information that might crack the case open, a name, a location, remained elusive. Forensic examiners turned to the Buick itself, painstakingly eliminating fingerprints belonging to Kelsey's family, her friends, and her boyfriend, people who had legitimate reasons to have touched the car. What remained were unidentified prints lifted from the seat belt, a small but crucial fragment of evidence that would later prove decisive. In the meantime, another avenue of investigation was unfolding with agonizing slowness: Kelsey's cell phone. Detectives believed that pinpointing the location of her last cell signal could lead them directly to her, and to whoever had taken her. But this simple, logical step became mired in a bureaucratic nightmare. Verizon Wireless, bound by privacy protocols that required more formal authorization before releasing subscriber location data, took 4 full days to hand over the records law enforcement needed. Every hour of that delay stretched like a blade across the nerves of everyone searching for Kelsey, her parents, who could do nothing but wait and pray, the detectives, who understood that time was the one resource they could not negotiate for more of, and the wider community, who had begun keeping vigil through candlelight gatherings and a website built specifically to coordinate the search for her. Word of Kelsey's disappearance spread far beyond Overland Park. National media outlets picked up the story. Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and America's Most Wanted all broadcast her image, her name, the outline of her disappearance, transforming a local tragedy into a story that gripped the entire country. Somewhere among the millions who saw that grainy image of the unidentified man from the Target footage was a woman who recognized something familiar in his face, her neighbor. When the accompanying detail about a suspicious 1970s-era Chevrolet truck also seen at the scene matched a vehicle she had seen near her own home, she made the call that authorities had been waiting for. By the evening of June 6th, 4 days after Kelsey vanished, police arrived at the home of Edwin Roy Hall in Olathe. They found him in the process of leaving town, his wife and young son with him, under the pretense of a family vacation. Whether Hall genuinely believed he could simply drive away from what he had done, or whether some deeper panic was propelling him toward the highway, only he could say. He was taken into custody that night, but even as Hall sat in an interrogation room, insisting he had been at the Target that evening, yet had never approached Kelsey, the truth was already tightening around him. His fingerprints matched those recovered from her seat belt. The lie collapsed under the weight of physical evidence, evidence that does not waver, does not forget, does not offer alibis. Investigators, piecing together his movements and his own eventual admissions, began to understand the horrifying calculation behind that evening. Hall had noticed Kelsey pulling into the Target lot and recognized, with a predator's instinct, that she was alone. He followed her inside not to interact with her, but to confirm that no one was waiting to meet her, that she truly had no one nearby who might intervene. When he saw she was preparing to leave, he returned briefly to his own truck to retrieve a weapon, then waited for the single most vulnerable moment of her evening, the walk from the store entrance to her car, to strike. He forced her into her own vehicle and drove her more than 20 miles away, deep into wooded terrain near Longview Lake in Grandview, Missouri, a place chosen not for any connection to Kelsey but simply for its isolation. There, in the darkness of those woods, far from the comfort of her family's home, far from the boyfriend who was waiting anxiously for her return, Kelsey Smith was physically assaulted and then strangled with her own belt. Her clothing, found near her body, bore stains of bleach, a detail that would later underscore the calculated cruelty behind the crime, an attempt to erase evidence of what had been done to her. It was Hall who then drove her car back across the state line to the Macy's parking lot, abandoning it there before fleeing into the night on foot, believing perhaps that distance and darkness would be enough to protect him. For 4 days, Kelsey's location remained unknown to everyone who loved her. Her parents clung to hope in the way that parents do, refusing to let go of the possibility that she might still be found alive, might still walk through the front door and end the nightmare. That hope persisted even as investigators, working against Verizon's bureaucratic delays, finally received the cell tower data they needed. A technician pinpointed the tower that had last connected with Kelsey's phone and instructed searchers to focus on an area roughly 1.1 miles to the north. Within 45 minutes of receiving that lead, on the afternoon of June 6th at 1:30 p.m., search teams found Kelsey's body in the wooded area near Longview Lake. The news broke the town's held breath in the cruelest possible way. The website that had been built to organize search efforts for Kelsey went dark almost immediately, then reappeared transformed into a memorial, a digital gravestone for a search that had ended not in rescue but in mourning. An autopsy confirmed what investigators already suspected. Kelsey had died of strangulation, and there was clear evidence of a struggle, evidence that she had fought for her life in those final moments in the woods. She had been assaulted as well, a violation layered atop the violence that had already taken everything from her. Hall was formally charged on June 7th with premeditated first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. As the investigation deepened, prosecutors in Johnson County secured a grand jury indictment that added charges of rape and aggravated sodomy, charges serious enough to make Hall eligible for the death penalty, a punishment that Johnson County District Attorney Phil Klein announced he intended to pursue. The case presented an unusual jurisdictional wrinkle, since Kelsey's body had been found across the state line in Missouri, which led some to argue that federal authorities should take the lead. But because Hall had been arrested and held in Kansas, Johnson County retained legal authority over the prosecution. The community that had spent 4 days searching for Kelsey now turned its collective grief and anger toward the courtroom. On July 23, 2008, during what had been scheduled as a hearing to consider moving the trial to a different venue, Edwin Hall stood before Judge Peter V. Ruddick and changed course entirely. As part of a negotiated plea agreement, he pleaded guilty to all 4 charges: capital murder, aggravated kidnapping, rape, and aggravated sodomy. The courtroom, packed with Kelsey's parents, extended family, friends, and reporters, absorbed the plea in a silence that must have felt both like relief and like reopening a wound. The hearing was broadcast live across all 4 of Kansas City's major television affiliates, a testament to how deeply this single crime had embedded itself in the region's collective consciousness. Later reporting revealed the chilling simplicity of Hall's own explanation for why he had chosen Kelsey that evening. He told investigators he had targeted her because he thought she looked young, and because he found something about her appearance appealing in a way no decent framework could justify. It was a confession that offered no real answers, no satisfying logic, only the bare confirmation that Kelsey had been chosen not for anything she had done, but simply for being visible, alone, and vulnerable in a public place that should have been safe. On September 16, 2008, Judge Ruddick handed down Hall's sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Kelsey and Smith. In accepting the plea deal, prosecutors had spared Hall the death penalty, a decision that undoubtedly carried its own complicated weight for Kelsey's family, who had to reconcile the certainty of a conviction with the absence of the ultimate punishment. In court, Hall turned to Kelsey's family and apologized for what he had done. Whether those words carried any real meaning, or whether they were simply the final performance of a man who had spent years constructing an ordinary facade, is something only Hall himself could know. He remains incarcerated at Lansing Correctional Facility in Lansing, Kansas. Kelsey Ann Smith was born on May 3, 1989, and died on June 2, 2007, at the age of 18. She had attended Shawnee Mission West, graduated only weeks before her death, and was building the ordinary, hopeful life of a young woman stepping into adulthood. A boyfriend she loved enough to plan an anniversary gift for, parents who trusted her enough to let her run a quick errand alone on a summer evening, a future that had not yet had the chance to take shape. She is buried at Johnson County Chapel and Memorial Gardens, a resting place that has become, for her family and community, a permanent site of remembrance. In 2009, Kansas passed the Kelsey Smith Act, a law requiring telecommunications companies to provide phone location information to law enforcement quickly in genuine emergency situations, rather than allowing bureaucratic caution to cost precious hours when a life might be at stake. Over the following decade, nearly 30 other states adopted similar legislation, and in February 2021, Congress passed a federal version of the Kelsey Smith Act, ensuring that no other family would have to endure the same agonizing wait that the Smiths did while searching for their daughter. In the years since, Kelsey's case has been revisited many times, retelling serving as both a memorial to who she was and a warning about the ordinary vulnerabilities hidden within routine moments of daily life. What happened to Kelsey Smith in that parking lot, in that brief unwatched sliver of time between the store's bright interior and the safety of her own car, remains one of the clearest and most painful illustrations of how quickly an ordinary evening can turn irreversible. Her memory endures not only in the grief carried by those who loved her, but in a law bearing her name, one designed to give other families the chance that hers was denied, the chance to be found in time. Story 5. The Denver apartment was warm, a small bubble of light and laughter against the cold January night. It was January 20th, 2018, and snow was expected in the early morning hours. But inside apartment 105 on South Albion Street, the only storm was a flurry of celebration. It was Kane Wilkins's birthday party, a week early, but a party nonetheless. At 43, Kane was a man who seemed to have found his place. He was a father to a son and daughter from a previous marriage, and for the past 7 years, a husband to Clarissa, a vibrant 30-year-old who went by Claire. Together, they had a 4-year-old daughter, the bright center of their blended family. To the casual observer, they were a modern couple navigating the familiar currents of life. Claire managed a local Dollar Tree, working full-time while Kane, who was not currently employed, held down the fort at home. On social media, Kane painted a picture of domestic bliss, a man content with his lot. "I am a blessed man," he had posted a few years earlier. "I'm not rich. I'm not poor. We live check to check as so many do. My family is healthy. Thank God." That night, the apartment was filled with the easy camaraderie of friends. There was music, dancing, and drinking. Lots of drinking. Claire, friends said, was in her element, smiling, laughing, having a wonderful time. Kane, the birthday boy, was right there with her. By all accounts, it was a good party, a normal party. But as the night wore on and the guest list dwindled, a strange and unsettling proposition would emerge from the haze of alcohol. A request that would alter the course of the evening and, ultimately, destroy the lives within the apartment's thin walls. The last guest to leave was a woman who didn't know the couple well. She was a friend of a neighbor who lived in the building. As she was getting ready to leave around 3 a.m., Claire approached her, her voice a delicate whisper. The invitation was awkward, veiled. Kane stood in the kitchen, watching. It took the guest a moment to understand what was being offered. They wanted her to stay, to join them in their bedroom. The guest, taken aback, politely declined. She was flattered, she said, but she just wasn't that kind of person. Claire seemed to understand, accepting the refusal with grace. But Kane was more insistent. He was irritated, the guest later recalled, that he wasn't getting his way. "It's really not about her," he said, gesturing towards his wife. "It's about me because of my birthday." The guest held firm, said her goodbyes, and left, making her way down the hall to her friend's apartment. The door to apartment 105 closed behind her, sealing the couple inside with the lingering tension of a rejected desire. The time was just after 3 a.m. What happened in the next 15 to 30 minutes is a vortex of conflicting accounts and violent noise, a story told in the echoes of screams and the chilling finality of a gunshot. A neighbor was awakened by what sounded like a woman's voice, a desperate, pleading cry of, "Oh my God! Oh my God! Why is this happening to me?" This was followed by a man's angry shout, "You need to get in here right fucking now." Then a cacophony of thumping, crashing, and what another neighbor thought was a door slamming loudly. And then a single sharp pop. The chaos then spilled out into the hallway. The door to the neighboring apartment burst open, and Kane Wilkins stumbled in, hysterical. He was wallowing loud, like hyperventilating. His friend would later tell police, screaming that Claire was dead, that she had killed herself. The two friends, the woman who had just left the party and her neighbor, rushed back to apartment 105. The scene that greeted them was one of surreal horror. Claire was on the bedroom floor, a catastrophic wound behind her right ear. She was still breathing, but Kane was not with her. He was in the hallway, collapsed in a screaming, hollering heap. His friend, seeing Claire's fight for life, was furious. "I yelled at him for him to get his ass up because she was still breathing," he recounted. "I said you need to get your ass up here, get in here and take care of your wife." It was a desperate plea to shock a man out of his grief and into action. It didn't work. Kane stayed where he was, a wailing, broken man, until the first officers arrived. The police and paramedics who flooded into the small apartment were met with a scene of devastation. Kane was now with Claire, holding her, his clothes and hands smeared with her blood. At 3:28 a.m., just minutes after the first 911 call, Clarissa Claire Wilkins was declared dead. As paramedics worked in vain, officers began to process the scene. The bedroom was in a state of disarray that suggested a struggle. A picture frame was broken, a fan and a laundry basket tipped over. Their attention was drawn to a large gun safe. In front of it, on the floor, sat a .40 caliber high-point handgun. The key was in the safe's lock, but this was not the weapon that had killed Claire. A spent 9mm shell casing lay on the floor near her head. Inside the safe, police found the murder weapon, a 9mm Smith & Wesson handgun, loaded, with what appeared to be blood near the barrel. Somehow, in the chaotic moments after the shot was fired, the gun that had killed Claire had been placed back inside the locked safe. Kane, still behaving erratically, was taken into custody. His hands were swabbed for gunshot residue, GSR, and his blood was drawn. His blood alcohol content was high. Claire's was an astounding .294, more than 3 times the legal driving limit. As he sat in the back of a police cruiser, his hysterical cries echoed in the cold night air. "Can somebody tell me what's going on with my wife?" he pleaded to the impassive officers. The initial investigation unearthed a series of baffling and contradictory clues. The GSR test came back with a damning result. 2 particles of gunshot residue were found on each of Kane's hands. Claire's hands, however, tested negative. The evidence seemed to point directly at Kane, but another piece of physical evidence told a different story. On Claire's blood-stained right hand, there was a blank spot on her palm, an area clear of blood that formed a distinct outline, an outline consistent with the shape of a pistol grip. It suggested that at the moment of the shooting, her hand had been wrapped around the gun. The autopsy added another layer of ambiguity. The medical examiner found that Claire had died from a single shot behind her right ear, an unusual but not impossible location for a suicide. Critically, there was no soot or stippling at the wound's site, which would have been expected from a close-range, self-inflicted shot. The evidence was a tangled mess, pointing in 2 directions at once. In his first interview with detectives, Kane was a grieving, confused husband. He claimed he was in the living room cleaning up after the party when he heard a pop. He ran into the bedroom and found his wife on the floor. He couldn't explain the signs of a struggle. He didn't remember the gun being put back in the safe. He portrayed his marriage as a happy one, free of recent disagreements. "We haven't had a disagreement since last New Year's Eve," he insisted. But Claire's childhood best friend, the first guest to arrive at the party that night, painted a much darker picture of the Wilkinses' marriage. She told detectives about a relationship riddled with control and intimidation. She described Kane as overbearing, a man who had slowly erased Claire's identity, replacing her music and her art with his own. And she recounted a chilling story, an anecdote from several years prior, before the birth of their daughter. An argument had grown so heated that Claire had called the police while Kane barricaded himself in the bedroom with a loaded gun. Claire's sister would later corroborate the history of violence, telling police that Kane had once chased Claire around the house with a loaded gun the day before their wedding, threatening to shoot her in the head. When detectives brought Kane back for a second interview, they confronted him with the evidence. They told him about the GSR on his hands, about the location of the murder weapon, about the unusual nature of the wound. Faced with these facts, Kane's memory became a convenient fog. He no longer denied the proposition to the party guest, but framed it as a casual thing that he and Claire had joked about afterward. As for the critical moments surrounding the shooting, his certainty dissolved. "Are you certain you were in the living room?" a detective pressed. "I don't know," Kane replied, his voice uncertain. "I remember that's where I was previously. I know we were sort of back and forth in between the rooms." He couldn't remember how the gun got in the safe. He couldn't remember how the room became a wreck. He couldn't remember anything beyond diving across the bed and holding his dying wife. The trauma, he suggested, or perhaps the alcohol, had wiped his memory clean. Investigators didn't buy it. Following the second interview, Kane Wilkins was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. In early February 2019, he stood trial in a Denver courtroom. The prosecution argued that Kane, his ego bruised and his desires thwarted, had flown into a drunken rage after Claire failed to procure a third partner for his birthday. They pointed to the GSR, the gun in the safe, and the neighbors' accounts of a violent argument as proof of a cold-blooded murder. The defense countered with the theory of suicide, arguing that Claire, deeply intoxicated and suffering from depression in her youth, had taken her own life. They presented the pistol grip-shaped void on her hand as their central piece of evidence. They argued the screams heard by neighbors could have been Kane's high-pitched cries of grief after finding her body. If Kane had killed her, they argued in the alternative, he was far too intoxicated to have formed the requisite intent for murder. After a 5-day trial, the jury returned a verdict. They acquitted Kane of first-degree murder, but found him guilty of the lesser charge of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to the maximum of 48 years in prison. But the story was far from over. In a moment that would ultimately unravel the entire case, the prosecutor, in the final moments of his closing rebuttal, made a direct, emotional appeal to the jury. "Hold him accountable for what he did," he urged, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "For the orphan he made their child." It was a single sentence, but it was a catastrophic error, a clear case of prosecutorial misconduct. The law is clear. Juries are to decide cases based on facts and evidence, not on appeals to sympathy for a victim, and especially not for a child who was barely mentioned during the trial. Kane's defense team filed an appeal, and in September 2022, in a stunning reversal, the Colorado Court of Appeals overturned the conviction. The judge's reasoning was a testament to the profound ambiguity of the case. They ruled that the evidence was so conflicting and inconclusive that the prosecutor's improper, emotional plea might well have been the factor that swayed the jury. "This is a very unusual case," wrote Judge John Daniel Daly. The court took the extraordinary step of attaching a photograph of Claire's blood-stained hand, with the blank outline of the pistol grip, to their official opinion, underscoring just how significant they found that piece of contradictory evidence. Given the closeness of the case, they could not say with any certainty that the misconduct had not affected the verdict. In August 2023, Kane Wilkins was granted a new trial and released from prison while he awaits a court date that may never be set. The tragic death of Claire Wilkins remains a haunting, unresolved mystery. Was she the victim of a controlling, narcissistic husband who killed her in a fit of birthday rage? Or was she a deeply troubled woman who, in a moment of drunken despair, took her own life, leaving behind a husband so traumatized he couldn't recall the event? The evidence offers two paths, two stories, both plausible and both deeply flawed. The truth of what happened in that apartment, in those few fatal minutes after the last guest left, is known only to two people. One of them is dead. The other claims he cannot remember. And so the case of Kane and Claire Wilkins hangs in a state of perpetual limbo, a heartbreaking testament to a life lost and a truth that may forever be shrouded in doubt. Story 6. The spring of 1975 was a time of transition in Montreal. The city was humming with the energy of a metropolis on the cusp of hosting the world. The final preparations for the following year's Summer Olympics a constant, thrumming backdrop to daily life. In the working-class neighborhood of Point St. Charles, a close-knit enclave of brick row houses and bustling streets known simply as the Point, life moved to a familiar rhythm. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, a community where kids played freely in the streets and neighbors looked out for one another. It was here, in this pocket of urban intimacy, that 16-year-old Sharon Pryor lived, a girl on the verge of womanhood, her future a canvas of bright, unpainted possibility. Sharon was, by all accounts, a beacon of youthful optimism. With a kind heart and a warm smile, she was a beloved daughter and a cherished older sister to her twin siblings, Doreen and Maureen. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, a testament to her gentle spirit. Her life was a tapestry of school, friendships, and the first blush of young love. But on the evening of March 29th, the Saturday before Easter, a thread of darkness was pulled, and the fabric of her life, and the lives of all who loved her, began to unravel with horrifying speed. The evening was cool, the last vestiges of a long Quebec winter clinging to the air. Sharon prepared to go out, a typical Saturday night plan ahead of her. She was going to meet her friends and her boyfriend at a nearby pizzeria on Wellington Street, a familiar and comforting destination, just a short walk from her home. At around 7 p.m., she said her goodbyes and stepped out into the night, disappearing into the familiar landscape of her neighborhood. She never arrived at the pizzeria. She never came home. As the hours ticked by, a knot of anxiety began to tighten in her mother Yvonne's stomach. By 11 p.m., with no word from her daughter, that anxiety had blossomed into full-blown panic. Yvonne called the police and reported her daughter missing. The search began immediately, a frantic effort by police and neighborhood volunteers who fanned out across the point, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their voices calling Sharon's name into the unanswering night. But she was gone, swallowed by a mystery that would haunt the city for nearly half a century. The hopeful, desperate search came to a devastating end 3 days later, on April 1st. Across the St. Lawrence River, in a quiet, wooded lot in the suburban city of Longueuil, a discovery was made that turned a missing person case into a brutal murder investigation. The body of Sharon Pryor was found, her young life extinguished with a savagery that was difficult to comprehend. The scene was one of profound violence. She had been brutally beaten, her face bearing the marks of a terrible struggle, and then raped and suffocated. A man's plain t-shirt had been used to restrain her, a silent, chilling piece of evidence left behind by her killer. Near her body, tire tracks were imprinted in the soft earth, the only other clue as to the identity of the monster who had brought her there. An autopsy confirmed the horrific details. The cause of death was asphyxiation, but she had also suffered numerous facial fractures. In 1975, the science of forensics was in its infancy compared to today's standards. Investigators were able to extract a small amount of DNA from the t-shirt in Sharon's clothing, but the sample was far too small to be tested or used in a court of law. With a foresight that would prove to be a crucial act of faith in the future, the evidence was meticulously preserved, a time capsule of a crime waiting for a science that did not yet exist. The investigation began with a tantalizing but ultimately frustrating lead. On the very same night that Sharon disappeared, on the very same street, another young woman, aged 22, reported a terrifying encounter. She told police that a man had attempted to kidnap her at knife point. Her description was chillingly specific: a tall, white, English-speaking man with blue eyes, brown hair, and a mustache. The suspicion was immediate and overwhelming. This had to be the same man who had abducted and killed Sharon. But the description fit countless men in a city of millions. With no name and no face to go with the description, the lead was a dead end. Over the years that followed, the investigation became a long, grinding exercise in frustration. More than 100 suspects were questioned and investigated, their lives scrutinized, their alibis checked. But none of them could be definitively linked to the crime. The case grew cold, the file thick with dead-end leads and unanswered questions. For the Longueuil police, the murder of Sharon Pryor became one of the city's most high-profile and painful cold cases, a constant, nagging reminder of a killer who had vanished without a trace. For Sharon's family, the passing years brought no peace, only the dull, constant ache of unresolved grief. Her mother, Yvonne, became the public face of their pain, a woman who refused to let her daughter's memory fade into oblivion. She made numerous public appearances, her voice trembling but resolute, ensuring that the story of Sharon Pryor was never forgotten. Her sisters, Doreen and Maureen, carried the loss in a more private, but no less profound way. "You may never have come back to our house or Congregation Street that weekend," Maureen would later say, her words a testament to a loss that remained as fresh as the day it happened. "But you have never left our hearts, and you never will." The man who had stolen Sharon's future was a ghost, a phantom who had haunted the family's lives for decades. But he was not a phantom at all. He was a man of flesh and blood, a man with a name and a long, violent history that stretched from the hills of West Virginia to the streets of Montreal. His name was Franklin Maywood Romine, and he was a predator hiding in plain sight. Born in Huntington, West Virginia, in 1946, Romine's life was a litany of violence and crime that began when he was just a child. By the time he was a young man, he had already amassed a significant criminal record. He was a restless, transient figure, a truck driver by trade who often used his job to move between the United States and Canada, a pattern that allowed him to slip through the cracks of law enforcement in both countries. His criminal history was a chilling prelude to the murder of Sharon Pryor. He had a history of prison escapes in West Virginia, a man who refused to be caged. In 1974, just a year before Sharon's death, he was arrested for breaking into a house and raping a woman in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Astonishingly, he was released on a bond of just $2,500. He immediately fled, violating his parole and seeking refuge in the familiar territory of Montreal, a city he had visited on at least 2 previous occasions. At the time of Sharon's murder in March 1975, Franklin Romine was a 28-year-old fugitive living in Montreal, a man with a proven history of brutal sexual violence. He lived near the scene of Sharon's abduction and was familiar with the wooded area in Longueuil where her body was later found. The description of the man who had attempted the kidnapping on Wellington Street, the tall, English-speaking man with brown hair and blue eyes, matched him perfectly. The tire tracks found near Sharon's body were compatible with the car he drove. He was the perfect suspect, a man whose past and present circumstances aligned with the crime in a terrifyingly precise way. And yet, his name never came up in the initial investigation. He remained a ghost, his connection to the crime completely unknown. His luck, however, did not hold forever. About 7 months after Sharon's murder, Romine was arrested by Montreal police and extradited back to the United States to face the charges in West Virginia. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison for the sexual assault in Parkersburg. He was released in 1981, and in a final brazen act, he returned to the very city where he had committed his most heinous crime, Montreal. His return was short-lived. In 1982, at the age of 36, Franklin Maywood Romine died in Montreal under circumstances that remain mysterious to this day. His body was returned to his family in West Virginia, where he was buried in the Pine Grove Cemetery in Putnam County, taking his dark secret to the grave. For nearly 40 years, it seemed that the truth had been buried with him. The break in the case came in June 2022, nearly half a century after the murder. It was a breakthrough born of the relentless march of science and the unwavering persistence of a new generation of investigators. Detective Sergeant Eric Rasico of the Longueuil Police, part of the force's Unsolved Homicide Case Unit, made the decision to revisit the evidence that had been so carefully preserved all those years ago. Advances in DNA technology had reached a point where it was now possible to analyze even the most minute or degraded samples. The DNA that had been extracted from the man's t-shirt, once insufficient for testing, was sent to a specialized lab in the United States. Using the new science of forensic genealogy, the same technology that had been used to unmask the Golden State Killer, the lab was able to build a partial DNA profile. They then uploaded this profile to public genealogy websites, searching for a familial match. The results were astonishing. The DNA from the crime scene showed a strong connection to the Romine family in West Virginia. The ghost finally had a name. Investigators from Longueuil traveled to West Virginia and, with the help of local prosecutor Mark Sorcia, began to approach Romine's relatives. 2 of his brothers voluntarily provided DNA samples, which confirmed the familial link. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with breathtaking speed. When investigators shared their suspicions about his brother with one of Romine's siblings, the response was chillingly direct. He told them that his brother had once tried to rape his own wife. He probably did it, he said of Sharon's murder. The final, definitive step required an act that seemed torn from the pages of a Gothic novel. On May 2nd, 2023, under the quiet watch of law enforcement from both Canada and the United States, The body of Franklin Maywood Romine was exhumed from its resting place in the Pine Grove Cemetery. A sample of his DNA was taken and sent for testing. On May 23, 2023, the results came back. It was a 100% match. The DNA from the man buried in West Virginia was the same as the DNA found on the t-shirt that had been used to bind Sharon Pryor. The ghost had been unmasked. The news was delivered to the Pryor family in a private, emotional meeting with the investigators who had finally solved the case. After 48 years of living in the agonizing limbo of not knowing, they finally had an answer. At a press conference, their faces a mixture of profound grief and weary relief, they shared their feelings with the world. "The solving of Sharon's case will never bring Sharon back," said her sister Doreen, her voice heavy with the weight of a lifetime of loss. "But knowing that her killer is no longer on this earth and won't kill anymore brings us to somewhat of a closure. Because Romine was dead, the case was officially closed. There would be no trial, no day in court, no formal rendering of justice. For the family, it was a bittersweet resolution. They had the truth, but the man responsible had escaped the earthly consequences of his actions. The case of Sharon Pryor is a testament to the enduring power of a family's love and the relentless pursuit of truth. It is a story that bridges a half-century of forensic science, from a time when DNA was an unknown concept to an era when a single, preserved piece of evidence could reach across the decades and unmask a killer. It is a story that finally, after 48 years of darkness, allowed a family to begin the long, slow process of healing, secure in the knowledge that the world finally knew the name of the man who had stolen their beloved Sharon from them. "Sharon has given us strength for the last 48 years, and especially today," Doreen said, her words a tribute to a sister whose memory had been their guiding light in a long, dark night that had finally, at last, found its dawn. Story 7. The summer of 1985 painted the Chicago suburbs in strokes of vibrant, almost defiant life. In unincorporated Glen Ellen, a patchwork of manicured lawns and quiet streets nestled in the heart of DuPage County, the air hung thick with the scent of cut grass and the distant hum of cicadas. It was a place of perceived safety, a community where screen doors slapped shut without a second thought and children's laughter echoed down sidewalks until dusk settled in a haze of violet and gold. The Wesselman family, living in a modest home that backed onto a sprawling field, was a fixture of this suburban idyll. Their daughter, Christina, known to everyone as Christy, was the embodiment of the town's youthful promise. At 15, she was a popular freshman at Glenbard South High School, a girl her mother, Sandra, would later describe with a voice thick with memory as vibrant, spirited, gifted, and amazing. She was a blur of energy and light, a voracious reader with a future that seemed as boundless as the Illinois sky. July 21st was a Sunday, one of those languid, sun-drenched days that seemed to stretch into infinity. Inside the Wesselman house, Sandy had planned a quiet afternoon with her daughter, a marathon of old movies that would carry them through the humid hours. But the small comforts of home required a small errand. They needed snacks. Sandy asked Christy to walk to the nearby Jewel supermarket, a trip so routine it was barely a consideration. Christy, ever obliging, grabbed her purse and headed for the door. As she stepped out into the afternoon glare, Sandy's voice followed her, a casual benediction steeped in maternal love. "Be careful, princess. I love you," she called out. It was a phrase spoken 1,000 times before, a simple farewell that on this day would become an unbearable final memory. Sandy watched her daughter disappear down the path, a bright spot of youth against the green landscape, never imagining those would be the last words she would ever say to her. The path Christy took was a well-worn artery connecting her subdivision to the commercial pulse of the grocery store. It cut through a field overgrown with summer weeds and wildflowers, a shortcut favored by locals, its familiarity a thin veneer over a hidden vulnerability. Security footage from the Jewel captured her inside, a fleeting, ghostly image of a girl in line, purchasing a candy bar and a soda for the afternoon movie marathon. She left the store and began her walk home, the plastic bag crinkling in her hand, her mind likely on the films waiting for her and the simple pleasure of a summer Sunday. But she was not alone on the path that day. Lurking in the shadows of the ordinary was a predator. Michael R. Jones, then 32, was a man whose life was a roadmap of violence. Just a few years earlier, in 1977, he had been convicted of raping 2 young women, one of them an 18-year-old named Jerry Michael whom he had assaulted at gunpoint. Sentenced to a term of 10 to 20 years, he had been paroled after serving only 6. The justice system, in its imperfect calculus, had deemed him fit to return to society. Shortly after his release, his path intersected with Christy Wesselman's. Why he was in Glen Ellen that day remains a mystery, one of the many senseless details that would haunt investigators for decades. He was a ghost in the machine, a random element of pure malice introduced into a peaceful world. What happened in the weed-choked field was a maelstrom of brutality that tore a hole in the fabric of the community. He attacked her on that familiar path, dragging her into the tall grass, away from unseen eyes. The ensuing struggle was desperate but brief. He sexually assaulted her and then, with a savagery that defied comprehension, stabbed her repeatedly, at least 8 times. As a final chilling act, he tied a shoelace from one of her own shoes around her neck. The vibrant, spirited girl who had walked out of her home just a short time before was gone, her life extinguished in a paroxysm of violence, her unfinished story left to bleed into the Illinois soil. Back at the Wesselman house, the sun began to dip below the horizon, and the old movies sat unwatched. Annoyance slowly curdled into worry, then bloomed into full-blown panic. A walk that should have taken minutes had stretched into an hour, then 2. Calls were made. Neighbors were questioned. The path was walked again and again. Christie's name called out into the gathering twilight, the only answer the chirping of crickets. The idyllic summer evening had transformed into a nightmare of uncertainty. The search began, a frantic effort by family and police that would stretch through the night, each passing hour a turn of the screw, tightening the knot of dread in Sandy's heart. The following day, July 22, 1985, the search came to its devastating conclusion. In the field between her home and the store, a searcher found her partially nude body, discarded among the weeds. The discovery sent a shockwave through Glen Ellen, shattering its sense of security. The news spread like a virus, a story of horror passed in hushed tones over backyard fences and across checkout counters. This was not something that happened here, but it had. DuPage County State's Attorney Robert Berlin would later describe it as a black cloud that settled over the community, an ominous presence that would linger for more than 30 years. An army of investigators from the DuPage County Sheriff's Office descended on the scene, their methodical work a stark contrast to the chaotic violence of the crime. They combed the field for every possible clue, bagging and tagging evidence, their faces grim. Critically, they collected biological samples from Christie's body, evidence that, in 1985, held limited promise. The science of DNA profiling was in its nascent stages, a futuristic concept more suited to science fiction than a suburban police department. Still, they preserved it with care, a microscopic time capsule of truth waiting for technology to catch up. The initial investigation was massive and exhaustive, but it yielded nothing. Leads were pursued across the country, hundreds of interviews were conducted, and thousands of man-hours were spent chasing shadows. But Michael Jones had vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving behind a wake of devastation and a wall of silence. The case went cold, but it never truly closed. For the Wesselman family and for the investigators who had looked upon the heartbreaking scene in that field, it became an open wound, a puzzle that demanded to be solved. For Sandy Wesselman and her husband, Bob, life became a fractured existence, a daily navigation of grief. The world had been cleaved into a before and an after. Sandy's life, as she would later state, had been shattered. She described the enduring pain in a victim impact statement that was decades in the making. A daughter's life, she said, was like a book, and Christie's was a story that would forever remain unfinished. Yet, through the fog of sorrow, a steely resolve took hold. Sandy became a fierce advocate for her daughter, a constant presence reminding the public and the police that Christie's killer was still out there. "There's a man out there who thinks he got away with murder," she told reporters years later. "Please help us take away his dream. He stole all of Christie's." In a 2011 interview, her hope, though weathered, remained intact. "It's a matter of time," she insisted, "before someone has the courage to come forward." The case's notoriety, and the profound injustice of it, even spurred legislative change. Joe Burkett, who was the DuPage County State's attorney in the years following the murder, was so moved by the Wesselman case that he pushed for a new law in Illinois. That law, enacted in 2002, would mandate that anyone convicted of a felony in the state must submit a DNA sample to a state database. It was a law born from Christie's tragedy, a tool designed to catch predators like the one who had taken her life. In a turn of poetic, heartbreaking irony, it would be this very law that would ultimately bring her killer to justice. But before justice, there was more pain. In the vacuum of a cold case, suspicion can fester and attach itself to the innocent. For a man named Randy Henry, the Wesselman murder became a personal curse. He was falsely suspected of the crime, and the allegation ruined his life. In a small community, the stain of such an accusation is impossible to wash away. He became a pariah, ostracized and judged by his neighbors. The weight of that false suspicion would follow him for decades. 30 years passed. Seasons changed, Glen Ellen grew and evolved, but the black cloud remained. Michael Jones lived a seemingly unremarkable life in Champaign, Illinois, hundreds of miles away from the field where he'd committed his most heinous crime. But the violence within him had not been dormant. He continued to assault women, his rage a constant, simmering threat. In July 2015, this pattern of abuse culminated in a conviction for felony aggravated domestic battery. As a matter of routine procedure under the very law Christie's case had inspired, he was required to provide a DNA sample. He swabbed his cheek, a minor bureaucratic inconvenience at the end of a legal process, likely giving it no more thought. That sample was sent to a state lab and entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the national database that had grown from a fledgling idea in 1985 into a powerful crime-solving tool. Meanwhile, in 2000, investigators from the DuPage County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit had submitted the evidence they had so carefully preserved from Christie's autopsy into that same system. For 15 years, that genetic profile had waited silently in the digital darkness, a ghost in the machine. On September 10, 2015, the silence was broken. In a state crime lab, two profiles collided, a 1 in a trillion match that lit up a computer screen and sent a jolt through the law enforcement community. The DNA from a 62-year-old domestic batterer in Champaign matched the DNA of the killer, who had vanished from a Glen Ellen field 3 decades earlier. After 30 years, 2 months, and 20 days, Christy Wesselman's killer had a name, Michael R. Jones. The news galvanized the cold case unit. Investigators who had lived with the case for their entire careers felt a surge of adrenaline and vindication. On Friday, September 18th, they executed a search warrant at Jones's home in Champaign. When confronted, Jones was defiant. They showed him a photograph of the bright-eyed, 15-year-old girl whose life he had stolen. "As God is my witness, I've never seen her before," he claimed, his words a hollow denial against the irrefutable truth locked in his own cells. He was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of aggravated criminal sexual assault. Even after his arrest, the evidence continued to mount. While in custody at the DuPage County Jail, Jones scrawled a message on a styrofoam cup, a desperate, cryptic confession. "I'm sorry for 1985. The mask of denial had slipped, revealing the guilt he had carried for 3 decades. The case finally moved toward a resolution. Jones's trial was scheduled for January 2018, but just days before it was set to begin, he blinked. Facing a mountain of evidence and the certainty of a life sentence, he entered a plea of guilty to the murder and sexual assault of Christy Wesselman. On January 23, 2018, The day of reckoning that Sandy Wesselman had awaited for 32 years finally arrived. The sentencing hearing was held in a packed DuPage County courtroom. It was a somber, emotionally charged proceeding, a culmination of decades of pain and persistence. Michael Jones, now 64, was a specter of his younger self, a frail-looking old man who bore little resemblance to the monster who had haunted a community's nightmares. The courtroom was a tableau of lives he had shattered. In attendance were Jerry Michael and Judy Van Kirk, two of the women he had raped in the 1970s. Their presence was a testament to his unbroken history of violence. Jerry, who had been his victim in 1977, looked at the man who had been released from prison early only to kill, and made a chilling observation. "Had he served at least the 10 years, she said, her voice heavy with the weight of what-ifs, "we wouldn't be here today for this." Randy Henry, the man who had lived under the shadow of false suspicion for so long, was also there, hoping for a closure that he admitted would likely never fully come. But the most powerful voice in the room belonged to Sandy Wesselman. Now 78, she stood and delivered an 11-minute victim impact statement, her words a torrent of love, grief, and righteous anger that had been held back for more than 3 decades. She spoke of her vibrant daughter, of the brilliant future she was denied, of the unfinished book of her life. Throughout her statement, she looked at the man who had taken everything from her only once, a fleeting glance that carried the weight of a lifetime of sorrow. She described the life-shattering loss, the endless void Christie's absence had created for her, her husband Bob, and Christie's 3 siblings. The judge sentenced Michael Jones to 80 years in prison, a sentence that ensures he will die behind bars. As the gavel fell, a sense of finality settled over the courtroom. Outside, Sandy Wesselman faced the media, her face a mixture of profound sadness and quiet relief. "It's a joyful day and a very sad day," she said, her words capturing the impossible duality of the moment. "We will always miss Christie." She spoke of the long, dark road her family had traveled, and of the uncertain path ahead. "I can go home today," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "and try to be a real person, whatever that is." For the first time in 32 years, the question of who killed her daughter had been answered. The black cloud over DuPage County had finally been lifted by the relentless forces of justice, powered by a mother's undying love and the silent, patient testimony of DNA. Story 8. The town of Brembate di Sopra, nestled in the Lombardy region of northern Italy, is a place where the air itself seems to carry a sense of deep-rooted tranquility. It is a community stitched together by quiet streets, modest homes, and the sprawling green of the Ada Nord Park, a landscape where the rhythm of life is dictated not by the frantic pulse of a nearby metropolis like Milan, but by the steady, predictable turning of the seasons. In late autumn, a gentle melancholy settles over the town. The crisp air carries the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, and the evenings draw in quickly, wrapping the community in a familiar, comforting darkness. It is a place where doors are left unlocked, where children walk to school alone, where the unspoken contract of collective safety is the very bedrock of existence. The idea of a monster lurking in the shadows is a fairy tale, a story told to frighten children, not a reality to be confronted on a quiet Friday evening. On November 26, 2010, that reality was about to be irrevocably shattered. The day had been an ordinary one for the Gambarejo family. Fulvio and Mora, a loving, hard-working couple, were raising their 4 children, Keba, the eldest, Yara, Natan, and Gioil, in a home filled with the cheerful, chaotic energy of a happy family. Yara, at 13, was the bright, shining star at the center of their universe. She was a girl on the cusp of womanhood, her life a whirlwind of school, friends, and an all-consuming passion for rhythmic gymnastics. She was not just talented, she was disciplined, dedicated, a girl with a fierce work ethic and a smile that could light up a room. Her days were a blur of pirouettes and ribbon tosses, her body a graceful instrument that moved with a strength and precision that belied her tender age. That Friday evening, as darkness fell over Brembate di Sopra, Yara had a simple errand to run. She was a leading member of the local gymnastics team, and they had a competition scheduled for the following Sunday. She needed to drop off a stereo at the town's sports center, a sprawling complex just 700 meters from her front door. A walk she had made countless times, a path so familiar she could have navigated it with her eyes closed. At around 5:30 p.m., she said goodbye to her mother, a casual farewell that held no hint of the terrible finality it would come to represent, and stepped out into the cool November air. Inside the sports center, the atmosphere was one of friendly, focused activity. Yara greeted her coaches and teammates, her presence a familiar, welcome sight. She handed over the stereo, chatted for a few minutes, and then, her task complete, prepared to head home. The last confirmed sighting of Yara Gambarejo alive was at 6:44 p.m. She walked out of the sports center, a lone figure moving with the easy confidence of a girl in her own backyard, and disappeared into the gathering dusk. Back at the Gambarejo home, the minutes began to stretch into a taut, anxious thread. Mora expected her daughter home by 7 p.m. When she hadn't arrived by 7:11 p.m., a knot of maternal unease began to form. She called Yara's cell phone. It rang unanswered. She called again, and again. The silence on the other end of the line was a cold, sharp-edged thing, a void where her daughter's cheerful voice should have been. Panic, that most primal and terrifying of parental emotions, began to take hold. Fulvio, returning home from work, found his wife in a state of growing terror. They called Yara's friends, her coaches, anyone who might have seen her. No one had. The simple, logical explanations, she'd stopped to chat with a friend, her phone had died, began to fray, replaced by a dark, formless dread. By 8 p.m., the dread had become unbearable. They called the Carabinieri, Italy's national police force, and reported their daughter missing. The initial response was swift. A search was launched, a small army of police officers and local volunteers fanning out into the night, their flashlights cutting anxious paths through the darkness. They scoured the 700-meter route between the sports center and the Gambarejo home, a path that should have taken Yara no more than 10 minutes to walk. They searched the park, the surrounding streets, their calls of Yara, echoing unanswered in the cold night air. The town of Brembate di Sopra, shaken from its peaceful slumber, held its collective breath, a community united in a single, desperate prayer for a young girl's safe return. But the night passed, and then another and another. The search grew, becoming one of the most extensive in Italian history. Hundreds of volunteers, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and fear, joined the professional search teams. They combed every field, every forest, every abandoned building in the area. Dogs trained to find the living, and then, as the days turned into weeks, dogs trained to find the dead were brought in. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their thermal imaging cameras scanning the landscape for any sign of human life. The face of Yara Gambarejo, her bright, hopeful smile a heartbreaking counterpoint to the growing despair, was plastered on every lamppost, in every shop window, on every news broadcast in the country. Her disappearance became a national obsession, a mystery that captivated and horrified Italy in equal measure. For the Gambarejo family, it was a descent into a living hell, a purgatory of not knowing that is in some ways crueler than the finality of death. Every ring of the phone, every knock at the door, was a jolt of hope and terror. They were suspended in a state of unimaginable torment, their lives frozen in the moment their daughter walked out the door and never came back. For 3 long, agonizing months, the search yielded nothing. It was as if Yara had been erased from the face of the earth, swallowed whole by the winter landscape. And then, on February 26, 2011, in a desolate, overgrown field in the industrial area of Cignolo di Isola, some 10 kilometers from Brembate di Sopra, the waiting finally came to a horrific end. A man, an aviation enthusiast, was flying a model airplane. The plane malfunctioned and crashed into a patch of dense brush. As he went to retrieve it, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Lying in the weeds, partially concealed by the overgrown vegetation, was the decomposed body of a young girl. It was Yara. The discovery sent a fresh wave of shock and grief through a nation that had been clinging to a dwindling sliver of hope. The place where she was found was a desolate, forgotten corner of the world, a place of weeds and industrial detritus, a place no one would have thought to look. The state of her body told a story of brutal, protracted violence. An autopsy would later reveal that she had not been killed by a single merciful blow. She had suffered multiple deep cuts, possibly from a small knife or a pointed tool, and a severe head wound, likely from being struck with a stone or falling on a hard surface. None of these injuries, on their own, would have been fatal. The final, terrible truth was that Yara had been left to die, alone in the cold, bleeding to death as hypothermia slowly, mercilessly claimed her. There were no clear signs of sexual assault, but the killer had left something behind, a microscopic clue that would become the central, obsessive focus of the investigation for years to come. A trace of male DNA on her leggings and underwear. The hunt for Yara's killer began, an investigation that would push the boundaries of forensic science and expose the dark, hidden secrets of a seemingly peaceful community. The pressure on the lead prosecutor, Letizia Ruggieri, and her team of investigators was immense. They had a victim, a crime scene, and a single tantalizing piece of DNA. But they had no suspect. The first break in the case, when it came, was a false dawn. Investigators, sifting through a mountain of data from cell phone towers, focused on a Moroccan construction worker named Mohammed Fikri. His phone had pinged a tower near the crime scene around the time of Yara's disappearance, and he was scheduled to leave the country on a ferry to Tangier. On a wiretap phone call, a translator heard him say something that was interpreted as a confession. "I didn't kill her." He was arrested in a dramatic raid on the ferry, his face splashed across the news as the monster who had killed Yara. But the arrest was a terrible mistake. With no other leads, the investigation turned to the only solid piece of evidence they had, the DNA. Ruggieri made a bold, unprecedented decision. She would attempt to find the killer by screening the DNA of the entire population of the region. It was a monumental undertaking, a search for a genetic needle in a haystack of millions. They began by collecting DNA samples from everyone who had frequented the sports center, from Yara's family and friends, from anyone who had even a remote connection to the case. The process was painstakingly slow, the lab work a meticulous, methodical search for a match. They called the unknown DNA profile Ignoto 1, Unknown 1. For months, the screening yielded nothing, and then a breakthrough, a partial match. The DNA of a man named Damiano Garanoni, a regular at a nightclub near the crime scene, showed a strong familial link to Ignoto 1. He was not the killer, but he was related to him. The investigators had found a branch of the family tree. Now they had to find the trunk. The trail led them to Damiano's uncle, Giuseppe Garanoni, a bus driver who had died in 1999. To confirm the link, they obtained a court order to exhume his body. A DNA test confirmed what they suspected. Giuseppe Garanoni was the father of Ignoto 1. But Garanoni had 2 sons, and neither of them was a match. The killer, they realized, had to be an illegitimate son, a secret child whose existence was unknown to the Garanoni family. The investigation now transformed into a genealogical detective story, a painstaking reconstruction of a dead man's life. They interviewed everyone who had known Giuseppe Garanoni, searching for whispers of a long-forgotten affair. The search led them to a woman named Esther Arzuffi. She had worked as a cleaner in the area and was rumored to have had a relationship with Garanoni. When investigators tested her DNA, they found the maternal link they had been searching for. Esther Arzuffi was the mother of Ignoto 1. The net was closing. Arzuffi had 2 sons. One of them, they were almost certain, was the killer. The focus of the investigation now narrowed to a single man, Massimo Giuseppe Bassetti, a 43-year-old construction worker, married with 3 children, a man who lived a quiet, unremarkable life in a nearby town. He had no criminal record, no history of violence. He was, to all appearances, a normal, hard-working family man. For months, the police put Bassetti under intense surveillance. They followed him, listened to his calls, watched his every move, waiting for the right moment to obtain his DNA without arousing his suspicion. The moment came in June 2014, almost 4 years after Yara's disappearance. They set up a fake roadside checkpoint, a DUI stop. Bassetti was pulled over and asked to take a breathalyzer test. As he blew into the tube, he unknowingly provided the police with the final piece of the puzzle. The DNA from his saliva was a perfect match to Ignoto 1. On June 16, 2014, Massimo Bassetti was arrested and charged with the murder of Yara Gambarejo. The news of his arrest sent a shockwave through a nation that had followed the case with a morbid fascination. The monster had a face, and it was the face of an ordinary man. Bassetti, from the moment of his arrest, steadfastly proclaimed his innocence. He was a family man, he insisted, a loving husband and father. He could never have committed such a heinous crime. He claimed his DNA must have been transferred to Yara's body through his work tools, which he said had been stolen. Or perhaps the DNA evidence itself was flawed, contaminated after years of exposure to the elements in that desolate field. His wife, Marita Comey, stood by him, providing him with an alibi for the night of the murder, an alibi that the prosecution would later pick apart, pointing to phone records that contradicted her story. The trial of Massimo Bassetti, which began in July 2015, was a national spectacle, a legal drama that played out under the intense glare of the media spotlight. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on the DNA evidence. They presented it as irrefutable, a rock-solid proof of Bassetti's guilt. The DNA, they argued, was of excellent quality, a near-perfect match that could not be a result of contamination or coincidence. They painted a picture of Bassetti as a man with a hidden darkness, a sexual predator who had abducted, assaulted, and murdered a vulnerable young girl. The defense, led by a team of determined lawyers, launched a ferocious attack on the DNA evidence. They argued that the investigation had been a case of tunnel vision, a desperate hunt for a suspect that had led the police to ignore other possibilities and to build a case around a single, flawed piece of evidence. They pointed to a critical and still controversial anomaly in the DNA analysis. While the nuclear DNA, inherited from both parents, was a match, the mitochondrial DNA, inherited only from the mother, was not a match to Bassetti's maternal line. The prosecution dismissed this as a minor, explainable discrepancy, but for the defense, it was a gaping hole in the prosecution's case, a sign that something was fundamentally wrong with the evidence. They requested that the DNA be retested, a request that was repeatedly denied by the court on the grounds that there was not enough of the original sample left to conduct a new analysis. The defense also pointed to other loose ends, other potential suspects that they claimed the police had failed to properly investigate. There was the gym instructor, Sylvia Brenna, whose blood was found on the sleeve of Yara's jacket. She had behaved erratically on the night of the disappearance, crying all night, according to her father, and deleting text messages she had exchanged with her brother around the time Yara vanished. She claimed she couldn't remember anything. Was she hiding something? The defense tried to cast suspicion on her, but the prosecution dismissed it as a desperate attempt to muddy the waters. The trial was a long, grueling affair, a battle of experts, a war of narratives. The prosecution presented a story of scientific certainty, of a killer unmasked by the unerring power of DNA. The defense presented a story of doubt, of a flawed investigation, of an ordinary man caught in a nightmare of circumstantial evidence, and a justice system determined to find a scapegoat. On July 1, 2016, after a year of testimony, the jury delivered its verdict. Massimo Bassetti was found guilty of the murder of Yara Gambarejo and sentenced to life in prison. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and condemnation, a deeply divided public still grappling with the lingering questions of the case. Bassetti and his legal team continued to fight. They appealed the verdict, but it was upheld by the Court of Appeal in 2017. They took the case to Italy's highest court, the Court of Cassation, and in October 2018, the life sentence was confirmed. The legal battle, it seemed, was finally over. But the story of Yara Gambarejo and the man convicted of her murder was not finished. The controversy over the DNA evidence continued to simmer. In 2019, Bassetti's lawyers once again demanded a review of the DNA evidence, a request that was once again denied. The lingering doubts about the case took a new, dramatic turn in December 2022, when it was revealed that Letizia Ruggieri, the lead prosecutor in the case, was herself under investigation for allegedly mishandling the DNA evidence, moving the samples without authorization and potentially compromising them in a way that made any future reanalysis impossible. Had it been a simple procedural error, or a deliberate act of obstruction, a final, desperate attempt to protect a conviction that was built on a foundation of scientific uncertainty? The question hangs over the case still, a shadow of doubt that refuses to be dispelled. For some, Massimo Bassetti is a monster, a cold-blooded killer who has been brought to justice by the power of modern science. For others, he is a victim, an innocent man framed by a flawed investigation and a justice system that was more interested in closing a high-profile case than in finding the real truth. What is certain is the heartbreaking loss of a young life, a life full of promise and light, extinguished in a cold, lonely field on a winter night. Yara Gambarejo, the girl with the infectious smile and the dancer's grace, has become a symbol of a nation's lost innocence. Her name now synonymous with one of the most complex, controversial, and captivating criminal cases in modern Italian history. The quiet town of Brembate di Sopra has returned to its peaceful rhythms, but the scar of Yara's murder will forever be a part of its story, a tragic reminder that even in the most tranquil of places, a terrible darkness can be waiting just beyond the reassuring glow of the streetlights. The case is closed, the killer is in prison, but the search for absolute certainty, for a truth beyond a reasonable doubt, continues. And in that search, the ghost of Yara Gambarejo lives on, a silent, haunting presence in the heart of a nation that will never forget her name.